The attorney's voice droned through the speakerphone like distant thunder, each word landing with the weight of stones. "Miss Hartley, I'm calling regarding the estate of Cornelius Van der Berg, who passed away 3 weeks ago in Rotterdam." Maura Hartley pressed the phone tighter against her ear, her other hand automatically reaching for her daughter Sophie, who sat beside her on their threadbare sofa. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom walk-up in Queens, where the radiator clanked all winter and the air conditioning was a luxury they couldn't afford. Through the thin walls, she could hear their neighbor's television. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sounds of other lives bleeding into their own. "I'm sorry," Maura said, her voice rough from exhaustion. She'd just finished a double shift at the nursing home, and her body ached in places she'd forgotten existed. "I don't know anyone by that name. Mr. Van der Berg was your great-uncle, your grandmother's brother. According to our records, you are his only surviving relative." Maura's mind spun backward through fragmented memories. Her grandmother had died when Maura was 12, and she remembered almost nothing beyond the smell of lavender and the feeling of soft hands braiding her hair. A brother? Her grandmother had never mentioned a brother. "What does this have to do with me?" The attorney cleared his throat, the sound crackling through the cheap phone speaker. "Mr. Van der Berg has left you his property in the Netherlands. A Windmill, to be specific. It's located in a rural area, about 40 kilometers outside Amsterdam." For a moment, Maura was certain she'd misheard. A windmill? Yes, a traditional Dutch windmill built in 1847. I should inform you that the structure is in significant disrepair. Mr. Van der Berg lived there alone for many years and was unable to maintain it properly. The local municipality has declared it structurally unsound. Sophie tugged on Maura's sleeve, her 8-year-old face scrunched with curiosity. "What's a windmill, Mama?" Maura covered the phone. "I'll explain later, baby." Maura, then, to the attorney. "Why would he leave this to me? I never even met him. I can't speak to his motivations, but the will is quite clear. The property, in its current condition, is yours, if you want it. I should warn you that Dutch property taxes will be your responsibility, and there may be demolition costs if you choose not to maintain it." Demolition costs. Property taxes. Maura looked around their apartment, at the bills stacked on the kitchen counter, at Sophie's shoes, with the worn-through soles, at the eviction notice she'd hidden in a drawer because she couldn't bear to look at it anymore. How much are we talking about? Approximately €3,000 annually for taxes. Demolition, if required, could run anywhere from €15,000 to €30,000, depending on the extent of the damage. Maura did the math quickly, converting euros to dollars in her head. The numbers made her stomach clench. She worked 3 jobs, the nursing home, weekend shifts at a laundromat, and occasional cleaning work when she could find it, and she still came up short every month. There was no way she could afford property taxes on the other side of the world, let alone demolition of a building she'd never seen. "What happens if I don't accept it?" "The property would revert to the Dutch government, who would likely demolish it and sell the land. There's been some interest from developers in the area." "Then, that's probably what should happen." The words tasted like defeat, but they were practical, responsible. The kind of decision she'd learned to make over 6 years of raising Sophie alone. The attorney was quiet for a moment. "Miss Hartley, may I speak candidly?" "Of course. Your great-uncle spent considerable time ensuring this property went to pen, you specifically. He researched your family extensively, found your contact information, and made very clear provisions in his will. Whatever his reasons, he wanted you to have this. Perhaps you might consider seeing it before making your final decision." After the call ended, Maura sat in the growing darkness of their apartment, the phone still in her hand. Sophie had wandered to the window, pressing her face against the glass to watch the street below. "Mama, what's a windmill?" Maura joined her daughter at the window, wrapping an arm around her thin shoulders. "It's a big building, with wings that spin in the wind. They used to use them to grind grain and pump water. Like a fairy tale?" Something in Maura's chest tightened. "Yeah, baby. Like a fairy tale." That night, after Sophie was asleep in the bed they shared, Maura pulled out her laptop, a 5-year-old model with a cracked screen that she'd bought used, and searched for information about Cornelius Van der Berg. She found very little. A brief mention in a historical society newsletter about traditional windmill preservation. A single photograph from 1987 showing a tall man with wild white hair standing in Tennepool riding event estate, front of a windmill, his expression stern and distant. The caption identified him as C. Van der Berg, last miller of De Hoop Windmill. De Hoop. The Hope. Maura clicked through more results, finding references to the windmill's history. Built in 1847 by the Van der Berg family. Operated continuously until 1992, when Cornelius's wife died. After that, he'd lived there alone, becoming increasingly reclusive. The local historical society had tried to convince him to allow restoration work, but he'd refused all offers, insisting the windmill was fine as it was. The most recent article was from a Dutch news site, dated 3 months earlier. The headline translated to "Historic Windmill Faces, Uncertain Future." The piece described De Hoop as a deteriorating landmark, its sails broken, its walls crumbling, a danger to anyone who might venture near. The municipality had been negotiating with Cornelius to either restore or demolish it, but he died before any agreement was reached. Now it was Maura's problem. She opened a travel website, pricing flights to Amsterdam. The cheapest option was still over $800 money she didn't have, couldn't borrow, couldn't imagine manifesting from thin air. But the attorney's words echoed in her mind. He wanted you to have this. Why? Why would a man she'd never met, who'd lived alone in a broken windmill on the other side of the world, leave her anything? What connection could possibly exist between them? Maura clicked through more search results, finding a genealogy site that mentioned the Van der Berg family. She traced the family tree backward, following branches that led to her grandmother, Johanna Van der Berg, who'd immigrated to America in 1958 at age 19. According to the records, Johanna had left the Netherlands suddenly, cutting all ties with her family. No one knew why. She'd married an American, changed her name, and never spoke of her homeland again. When she died, she'd been buried under her married name, with no mention of her Dutch heritage. A family secret, buried and forgotten, until now. The next morning, Maura called in sick to the nursing home for the first time in 3 years. She told them she had a family emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie. Then she spent the day making calls, researching, calculating possibilities that seemed to dissolve the moment she examined them too closely. She called her sister Emma, who lived in California with a husband who worked in tech and 2 children in private school. Emma's life was everything Maura's wasn't. Stable, comfortable, secure. A windmill? Emma's voice carried a mixture of amusement and concern. "Maura, you can't be seriously considering this." "I'm not. I mean, I don't know. Don't you think it's strange that he left it to me specifically?" "I think it's strange that some old man we never met died and dumped his problems on you. You can barely afford your apartment. How are you going to maintain a building in the Netherlands?" "I know. But nothing. Tell them to demolish it and be done with it. You don't need another burden." Emma meant well, Maura knew, but her sister had never understood what it meant to have nothing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. To work 3 jobs and still fall short. To watch your daughter outgrow her clothes and know you couldn't afford replacements. Emma had never had to choose between electricity and groceries. Never felt the weight of bills she couldn't pay, crushing the air from her lungs. "You're probably right," Maura said, though the words felt hollow. After she hung up, Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her pajamas, even though it was almost noon. She should have been at school, but Maura had kept her home, needing her daughter close, while she figured out what to do. "Are we going to see the windmill?" "Baby, it's very far away, in a different country." Like a vacation? Maura's heart broke a little. They'd never taken a vacation, never been to a beach or a theme park, or anywhere that required money and planning and the luxury of time off. Sophie's entire world was contained within a few blocks of their Queens apartment. "It's not really a vacation place. It's old and broken. Can we fix it?" The question was so innocent, so full of a child's certainty that problems had solutions, that broken things could be mended. Maura wanted to preserve that innocence, to protect Sophie from the harsh mathematics of poverty that said some things stayed broken because fixing them cost more than you had. "I don't think so, sweetheart." But Sophie's question lingered as the day wore on, as Maura returned to work for her evening shift at the laundromat, as she folded other people's clothes and wondered what it would be like to have enough money that you paid someone else to do your laundry. The breaking point came 3 days later. Maura arrived at the nursing home for her morning shift, to find her supervisor waiting with an expression that telegraphed bad news. "Maura, we need to talk." They went to the small office that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment. Her supervisor, Linda, was a kind woman who'd been in healthcare for 30 years and understood the impossible demands placed on people who did this work. "Corporate is cutting hours," Linda said without preamble. "I fought for you, but they're reducing everyone to part-time. 20 hours a week, maximum. 20 hours. Maura felt the floor tilt beneath her. She'd been working 40 hours here, plus her other jobs. Losing half her hours meant losing half her income. "When?" "Starting next week." "Linda, I can't. I need those hours. I have a daughter." "I know. I'm sorry. If I could change it, I would." Maura walked out of that office in a daze. She made it through her shift on autopilot, going through the motions of caring for patients who deserved better than a nurse too shell-shocked to focus. When she finally left, she sat in her car in the parking lot and let herself cry. She couldn't afford the apartment on reduced hours, couldn't afford food or utilities or Sophie's school supplies. She was going to lose everything, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Did you tell the lawyer to demolish that windmill yet?" Maura stared at the message for a long time. Then she opened her banking app and looked at her balance. $247.32. Not enough for rent, not enough for groceries, not enough for anything that mattered. But it was enough for a gamble. She dialed the Dutch attorney's number, her hands shaking. "Miss Hartley, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." "The windmill," Maura said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is there any possibility it's worth something? Any chance? There's value there beyond the structure itself." The attorney was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure what you're asking. I'm asking if there's a reason Cornelius Van der Berg wanted me to have it. If there's something there worth finding." Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Hartley, I handled your great-uncle's legal affairs, 15 years. He was an eccentric man, very private. He spoke often about the windmill, about its history and importance, but he never mentioned anything of monetary value beyond the property itself. But he specifically wanted me to have it. He did. And he left one additional item for you, a letter. I was instructed to give it to you only if you came to the Netherlands in person. A letter. A message from a ghost. I'll be there, Maura heard herself say. I don't know how yet, but I'm coming. The next week passed in a blur of impossible logistics. Maura sold everything she could spare: her laptop, her television, a gold necklace her mother had given her before she died. She picked up every extra shift she could find, working until her body threatened to give out entirely. Sophie didn't understand why they were suddenly eating only rice and beans, why Mama was gone, even more than usual, why they'd sold the TV. But she didn't complain, sensing somehow that questions would make things harder. Emma called twice, each time telling Maura she was making a mistake, that she was being reckless, that she should accept reality and focus on practical solutions like finding a cheaper apartment or applying for assistance. You're chasing a fairy tale, Emma said during their last conversation. And when you get there and find nothing but a broken building, you'll have wasted money you couldn't afford to waste. Maybe, Maura admitted. But what if I don't go, and there's something there? What if this is the one chance I get to change things? That's not how life works, Maura. You don't get fairy tale endings. You get what you work for. And sometimes, not even that. Emma was probably right. She usually was. But Maura thought about Sophie asking if they could fix the windmill, about that innocent certainty that broken things could be mended. What kind of lesson was she teaching her daughter if she didn't at least try? 2 weeks after the attorney's first call, Maura and Sophie boarded a plane to Amsterdam with 2 small suitcases and $1,200. In cash, every penny Maura had been able to scrape together. It was insane, reckless, the kind of decision desperate people made when they'd run out of practical options. But as the plane lifted off and Sophie pressed her face to the window, watching New York disappear beneath clouds, Maura felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. Amsterdam in October was cold and wet, the sky a perpetual grey that seemed to press down on the narrow streets and canals. Maura and Sophie emerged from the airport into a world that felt simultaneously alien and familiar, as if some genetic memory recognized this place her grandmother had fled 60 years ago. They took a train to a small town called Oostzaan, then a bus that wound through flat countryside where water seemed more prevalent than land. Sophie's eyes were wide, taking in windmills that dotted the Kant, landscape like giants, frozen, mid-stride. They're everywhere, she whispered, her breath fogging the bus window. This is where they were invented, Maura said, remembering something she'd read during her frantic research. Hundreds of years ago, the bus dropped them at a rural stop where the only visible structure was a small cafe and a road that disappeared into the distance. According to Maura's phone, De Hoop Windmill was 3 kilometers west, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable in heavy rain. It wasn't raining yet, but the sky promised it soon. They walked, their suitcases bumping along the uneven path. Sophie complained at first, her legs tired from the long journey, but soon fell silent as the windmill appeared in the distance. De Hoop rose from the flat landscape like something from a dark fairy tale. Even from a distance, its deterioration was evident. 2 of its 4 sails were missing entirely, the remaining 2 hanging at broken angles like shattered wings. The cylindrical tower, which should have been pristine white, was stained and crumbling, patches of brick showing through where plaster had fallen away. It's bigger than I thought, Sophie said softly. Maura had expected to feel disappointment, but instead she felt something closer to recognition. This building, like her, had been beautiful once, had served a purpose, had been valued and maintained. And then time and circumstance had worn it down until it stood, alone and broken, waiting for someone to decide its fate. They reached the base of the windmill as the first drops of rain began to fall. A rusted padlock secured the door, but when Maura tried her key, provided by the attorney, it turned with surprising ease. The door swung open, revealing darkness and the smell of abandonment. "Stay close," Maura told Sophie, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. The interior was vast and empty, the ceiling disappearing into shadows far above. Water damage was evident everywhere. Stains on the walls, puddles on the stone floor, the pervasive smell of mold. Wooden beams that once supported the mill's machinery hung at dangerous angles, some having pulled free from their moorings entirely. "Mama, I'm scared." "Me too, baby." They explored cautiously, finding remnants of Cornelius's life. A small living area in what had once been the grain storage room, furnished with a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs. Everything was spare and simple, the possessions of a man who'd needed very little. In the corner, Maura found a wooden chest. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, documenting the windmill's history. Images from the 1800s showing the Van der Berg family posing proudly in front of their mill. Pictures from the 1950 seconds of a young couple, presumably Cornelius and his wife, standing in the doorway, their faces bright with hope and determination. And at the bottom of the chest, an envelope with Maura's name, written in shaking handwriting. She opened it with trembling fingers. "Dear Maura," the letter began. "If you are reading this, you have come. I hoped you would, though I had no right to expect it. You do not know me, but I knew your grandmother, my sister Johanna. We quarreled terribly when she was young, and she left for America, swearing never to return. I was a stubborn fool and did not try to mend things. By the time I wanted to, it was too late. She was gone, and I was too proud to admit I was wrong. I followed your family from a distance. I learned about your mother's death, your struggles, your beautiful daughter. I saw you working multiple jobs to survive, and I recognized in you the Van der Berg determination that made our family successful for generations. This windmill has been in our family since 1847. Every Van der Berg for 5 generations has lived here, worked here, died here. I am the last, and when I am gone, De Hoop will die too, unless someone chooses to save it. The municipality says it must be restored or demolished. They do not understand that some things are worth more than money, that history has value beyond what can be calculated in euros. They do not see what I see. I am leaving you more than a broken building. I am leaving you a choice, and perhaps an opportunity. What you do with it is up to you. But know that I chose you specifically because I believe you are strong enough to make the hard decisions I could not make. There is something you should know about De Hoop. In 1943, during the Nazi occupation, my father hid something precious in the windmill's foundation. He died before he could retrieve it, and I was too afraid to look. I spent my entire life living above a secret, too cowardly to confront it. I am telling you this not to burden you, but to give you information I wish I'd had courage to act on. The choice is yours, as it should have been mine. Whether you keep the windmill or let it fall, whether you search for what is hidden or walk away, any choice you make will be braver than my lifetime of paralysis. With regret and hope, your great-uncle, Cornelius. Maura read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. Hidden in the foundation, something precious. 1943. Mama, what does it say? How did you explain to an 8-year-old that a man you'd never met had left you a riddle wrapped in history, wrapped in a building that was falling apart around you? It says your great-great-grandpa hid something here during a war, a long time ago. Sophie's eyes widened. Like treasure? Maybe. Or maybe it's nothing. But even as she said it, Maura felt certainty settling in her bones. Cornelius hadn't brought her halfway around the world for nothing. He'd spent his entire life knowing something was hidden here, too afraid to look, but unable to forget. Now he'd passed that burden or opportunity to her. The rain intensified, drumming against the windmill's roof with a sound like distant applause. They spent the night in Cornelius's sparse living quarters, huddled together under blankets they'd found in a chest, listening to wind whistle through gaps in the walls. Maura couldn't sleep. Her mind spun through possibilities and problems in equal measure. Even if there was something hidden in the foundation, how would she find it? The windmill was massive, its base buried in earth, and brick accumulated over 175 years. She had no equipment, no expertise, no money to hire people who did. And she had perhaps 2 weeks before her meager funds ran out, and she'd have to return to New York with nothing but a broken building she couldn't afford to keep. In the morning, she walked to the cafe they'd passed the previous day. The owner, a woman named Saskia, who looked to be in her 60s, greeted her with the warm curiosity small town residents reserved for strangers. "You must be the American," Saskia said in nearly perfect English. Cornelius's relative. News traveled fast in small communities. "I am Maura Hartley." She showed Saskia a photo on her phone of Sophie, still sleeping back at the windmill. "That's my daughter. Cornelius spoke of you once, near the end. He said his niece's granddaughter was living a hard life in America, working too much for too little. He said she reminded him of his father, strong but unlucky. Did you know him well?" Saskia poured coffee without asking, sliding the cup across the counter. "As well as anyone could. He was private, but he came here every Tuesday for coffee and stroopwafel. We talked about simple things, weather, local news. Near the end, he talked more about the past. Did he ever mention hiding something during the war?" Saskia's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. The war years were difficult for everyone. Many people hid things, people, valuables, documents. Cornelius's father was part of the resistance. He helped Jews escape, hid resistance members, gathered intelligence for the Allies. Do you know what he might have hidden in the windmill? No, but there were rumors. Stories that changed over the years until no one knew what was true and what was embellishment. Saskia leaned forward, her voice dropping. Some said he helped smuggle art that the Nazis were looting. Others claimed he hid gold. My grandmother believed he was keeping documents that could identify Nazi collaborators. Whatever it was, he died in 1944 without revealing it, shot by German soldiers for suspected resistance activities. And Cornelius never looked. He was 6 years old when his father died. By the time he was old enough to search, he was too afraid of what he might find, or not find. The not knowing became safer than knowing. Maura understood that intimately. Sometimes the possibility of something better was easier to bear than the certainty of nothing at all. She returned to the windmill to find Sophie awake and exploring, her child's fearlessness making her braver than Maura felt. Together, they examined the foundation, which was partially visible in the earthen cellar beneath the main floor. The cellar was flooded, several inches of water covering the floor. The walls were brick, ancient and water-stained, covered in places with what looked like centuries of grime and neglect. "How do we find something hidden in this?" Sophie asked, her voice echoing in the damp space. "I don't know, baby." They spent the morning searching anyway, examining every brick, tapping on walls, listening for hollow sounds, looking for any indication that something might be concealed. They found nothing but water damage, mold, and the accumulated debris of decades. By noon, Maura was ready to give up. She sat on the stone floor, her clothes soaked and filthy, fighting back tears of frustration. "Mama, look." Sophie was pointing at the wall, at what appeared to be scratches in the brick. No, not scratches, letters. Someone had carved something into the masonry, but time and water damage had made it almost illegible. Maura moved closer, using her phone's light to illuminate the marks. She could make out partial letters: A, N, D, M, O, E, R. Vandmoer, Sophie read slowly, sounding out the Dutch word. "I don't know what that means." They photographed the marking, and Maura showed it to Saskia when they returned to the cafe for a late lunch. "Vandmoer," Saskia said, immediately. "It's an old Dutch word. It means from mother. But also, this was the name of a family that lived in the area during the war." Hendrik van Moer was an art dealer in Amsterdam. Art. Before the Nazis occupied the Netherlands, many Jewish families and art dealers tried to hide or smuggle their collections. Some succeeded, most didn't. Hendrik van Moer disappeared in 1943, sent to the camps. His collection was never found. Maura felt electricity run through her. What was in his collection? No one knows exactly. The records were destroyed. But the Van Moer family had faith, been wealthy for generations. They collected Dutch masters, primarily Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals. Back at the Windmill, Maura examined the carved letters with new urgency. If Cornelius's father had helped hide the Van Moer collection, if even part of it was still here, it would be worth. She couldn't let herself think in numbers yet. First, she had to find it. The problem was the cellar. The flooding made detailed examination impossible, and she had no equipment to pump out the water. She spent the afternoon searching the rest of the Windmill for clues, finding nothing but confirmation of what the municipality had said. The structure was dangerously unstable, its wooden beams rotted, its walls crumbling. That night, lying in the narrow bed with Sophie curled against her, Maura made calculations. She had perhaps 10 days left before her money ran out. 10 days to find something that might not exist, hidden in a foundation she couldn't fully access, in a building that was literally falling apart around her. The next morning, she walked to the village, a collection of perhaps 30 houses clustered around a small church, and found the address Saskia had given her for the local historical society. A man named Peter answered the door, elderly and sharp-eyed, suspicious of the American asking questions about the war. "I'm Cornelius's great-niece," Maura explained. "I inherited De Hoop Windmill." "Ah." Peter's expression softened slightly. "Come in." His house was a museum of local history, walls covered with photographs and maps, shelves crammed with books and documents. He served tea and sat across from her with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. "What do you want to know?" "Everything about Cornelius's father, about what he might have hidden during the occupation." "Willem van der Berg was a hero," Peter said simply. "He saved at least 15 Jewish families, hid resistance fighters, passed information to Allied intelligence. The Nazis suspected him but could never prove anything, until someone betrayed him. Who? No one knows. There were rumors, but no proof. The collaborator was never identified. Willem was arrested in November 1944, shot 3 days later. He never revealed any information under interrogation, and whatever he was hiding stayed hidden. Yes, the Windmill was searched 3 times during the occupation, but the Germans found nothing. After the war, Willem's widow, Cornelius's mother, tried to find whatever her husband had hidden. She died in 1963, still searching. "What do you think he hid?" Peter stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder, yellowed with age. In 1998, a researcher from the Dutch Ministry of Culture came here investigating stolen art. She was tracking the Van Moer collection. According to her research, Hendrik van Moer contacted Willem van der Berg in July 1943, just before the Van Moers were arrested. The researcher believed Willem helped hide at least part of the collection. He showed Maura photocopied documents, letters, manifests, invoices. The Van Moer collection had included 12 paintings, various sculptures, and a significant collection of drawings and prints. Conservative value in 1,943, 200,000 guilders. Today's value, potentially 95 million euros or more, depending on authentication and condition. The researcher never found anything. She searched the Windmill with ground-penetrating radar, found anomalies in the foundation, but couldn't determine what they were. The technology was primitive then, and Cornelius refused to allow excavation. He said the windmill was structurally unsound and digging would cause collapse. Was he right? Probably. The mill has been deteriorating since his wife died in 1992. He couldn't maintain it alone, and he refused all offers of help. Maura thought about Cornelius's letter, about a man who'd spent his entire life living above a secret he was too afraid to confront. Did the researcher leave any records, maps showing where the anomalies were? She did. Pieter returned to the filing cabinet. I keep everything. History matters, even when no one is left. Who remembers why? The maps were technical and difficult to read, covered in notations that meant nothing to Maura. But Pieter translated, explaining that the anomalies were concentrated in the southeast section of the cellar, approximately 2 meters below the current floor level. 2 meters? Maura felt hope deflating. I'd need excavation equipment. Structural engineers. You'd need money you don't have, Pieter finished kindly. This is why the mystery remained unsolved. Investigating properly would cost hundreds of thousands of euros, with no guarantee of finding anything. Maura left Pieter's house with photocopies of the maps and a crushing sense of impossibility. Even if art worth 95 million euros was hidden in the windmill's foundation, she had no way to reach it. She was a home health aide from Queens, with $800 left to her name, and a daughter who needed to return to school. She'd come all this way for nothing. That afternoon, she composed an email to the Dutch attorney, informing him she would be demolishing the windmill. She couldn't afford to keep it, couldn't afford to maintain it, couldn't afford to chase ghosts in its foundation. But before she could send the email, Sophie called from the cellar. Mama! The water's going down. Maura rushed to find her daughter standing in the cellar, which was indeed draining. The heavy rains had stopped 2 days ago, and apparently there was natural drainage she hadn't noticed. The water level had dropped several inches, revealing more of the brick walls. And carved into those walls, at regular intervals, were more letters. Not just Van Moer, but what appeared to be a message, written in Dutch, in careful script that had survived decades beneath water. Help me. Clean this off, Maura said, her hands already scrubbing at accumulated grime. They worked for hours, using brushes they'd bought at a local shop, carefully revealing text that had been hidden for 77 years. As letters became words and words became sentences, Maura felt her heart racing. Faster. The message was from Willem van der Berg, dated November 1944 days before his death. To whoever finds this, it read in Dutch, that Saskia later translated for her. I have hidden 12 paintings and various other artworks in a sealed chamber beneath this cellar floor. The entrance is marked with the Van Moer family crest, a swan with an olive branch. The chamber is waterproof and climate-controlled, built according to specifications Hendrik van Moer provided. The art belongs to the Dutch people, to be returned to rightful owners or their descendants when it is safe to do so. If you are reading this, I am likely dead. The Nazis are losing this war, but they will destroy much before they fall. Do not let them destroy this. Do not let greed destroy it either. This is history, culture, the soul of our people, preserved against darkness. The swan watches over all. Look for her above the place where water meets earth. Maura and Sophie searched the cellar with new purpose, examining every brick, every stone, every mark. It was Sophie who found a small carving near the ceiling where wall met floor joists, so covered in grime it was almost invisible. A swan, wings spread, an olive branch in its beak. Directly below the carving was a section of floor that looked identical to the rest, ancient stone blocks fitted together and cemented with what appeared to be centuries of accumulated mortar. But when Maura tapped on it, the sound was different, hollow. "We found it," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Maybe," Maura cautioned, though her own hands were shaking. "We don't know what's down there, or if we can even get to it." The next morning, she returned to Pieter with photographs of Willem's message and the swan carving. His hands trembled as he examined them. "This is extraordinary. Historical documentation of resistance activity, written by Willem himself." He looked at Maura with new respect. "You found what everyone else missed. What do I do now?" "You contact the Dutch Ministry of Culture immediately. If the Van Moer collection is down there, it belongs to the Dutch government and to any surviving family members. This is not treasure hunting, this is recovering stolen art. But the windmill is mine." "Yes, but the art is not. However, Dutch law provides for a finder's fee, typically 10% of the recovered value. If you do this correctly, if you work with authorities rather than trying to profit privately, you could receive several million euros. More importantly, you'd be doing the right thing. Several million euros. Even 10% of 95 million would change everything. But it was more than money. It was finishing what Willem van der Berg had started, honoring a man who died protecting these works. It was giving Cornelius the ending his cowardice had denied him. It was proving to Sophie that sometimes the world rewarded doing the right thing. The Dutch Ministry of Culture responded within hours of Maura's email. By the next day, 2 officials had arrived at De Hoop Windmill, accompanied by art historians, structural engineers, and a team with ground-penetrating radar, far more sophisticated than what had been used in 1998. They confirmed what Willem's message had claimed: a void space beneath the cellar floor, approximately 3 meters by 4 meters, depth of about 2 meters. The chamber appeared to be sealed, structurally separate from the windmill's foundation. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing," the lead engineer said, studying the radar images. "It's essentially a small bunker, reinforced concrete, with what appears to be climate control elements. Sophisticated for 1943. Can we access it without destroying the windmill?" The engineer studied the deteriorating structure, his expression grave. "The windmill is already beyond saving. But we can access the chamber carefully, document everything properly. If there's art down there, we'll preserve it." The excavation took 3 days. Maura and Sophie stayed at a small hotel in the village, not allowed near the windmill, while structural engineers determined it was safe to dig. Each morning they walked to Saskia's cafe, where the owner updated them on progress gleaned from workers who stopped by for coffee and gossip. On the 3rd day, Saskia called Maura's phone at 6 a.m. "They've opened it," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "You need to come now." The scene at the windmill was controlled chaos. Ministry officials, historians, conservators in protective gear, security personnel, keeping back the small crowd of villagers who'd gathered to witness history being uncovered. The senior official, a woman named Dr. Maura van Doorn, met Maura at the Dan entrance. "Miss Hartley, thank you for your patience. What we've found is—" she paused, searching for words. "Extraordinary doesn't do it justice." They led her into the cellar, now illuminated by portable lights, where a section of floor had been carefully removed, revealing stone steps, leading down into the hidden chamber. The chamber is sealed and climate-controlled, as Willem described. Hendrik van der Berg must have had connections to let him build something this sophisticated in 1943. We're still cataloging, but initial assessment confirms at least 11 paintings, multiple sculptures, drawings, and documents. 11? Willem said 12. One may have been removed or relocated, or his count was incorrect. Either way, what's here is— Dr. Van Dorn gestured toward the stairs. "Would you like to see?" The chamber was small but perfectly preserved, its walls lined with shelves that held wooden crates marked with Van der Berg's name. In the center of the space, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and protective materials, stood several large frames. Conservators were photographing everything, documenting positions before anything was moved. One painting had already been partially unwrapped, enough to reveal the corner of what appeared to be a portrait in the Dutch Golden Age style. "We believe that's a Frans Hals," Dr. Van Dorn said softly. "If authenticated, it could be worth 20 to 30 million euros alone. There are also what appear to be 2 Vermeers, several Rembrandts, and works by artists whose names I won't attempt to pronounce." Maura felt tears on her face, though she couldn't remember starting to cry. They survived. All this time, they were down here, safe, thanks to your great-great-grandfather's courage and your Berg's great-uncle's faith in you. Without Cornelius leaving you the Windmill, this would have remained lost forever. The authentication process would take months, Dr. Van Dorn explained. Each piece needed to be examined, verified, documented. Provenance would be established, connections to surviving Van der Berg family members pursued. But preliminary assessment valued the collection at approximately 95 million euros. Per Dutch law governing found art, you're entitled to a 10% finder's fee, approximately 9.5 million euros, payable once all authentication is complete and the works are formally accessioned into state collections or returned to families. 9.5 million euros. Over $10 million. Maura's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the cellar floor, her vision swimming. Sophie, who'd been allowed to join them, threw her arms around her mother. "Is that a lot, Mama? Is that enough?" "Enough. More than enough. More than Maura had earned in her entire life. More than she'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to never work 3 jobs again. Enough to send Sophie to any school she wanted. Enough to breathe." But it was more than money. It was Willem van der Berg's legacy, rescued from darkness. It was Cornelius's final act of courage, trusting a stranger to do what he couldn't. It was proof that sometimes, impossibly, broken things could lead to treasures. The media found them within hours. By evening, the story was international news. Single mother discovers $100 million art hidden in Dutch windmill. The numbers got inflated with each retelling. The story simplified into fairy tale narratives that missed the complexity of what had really happened. Emma called from California, her voice carrying an emotion Maura couldn't quite identify. "I saw the news. You actually did it. You found treasure in a broken windmill." "I found Willem's courage and Cornelius's faith," Maura said, too exhausted for triumph. "The treasure was just what that led to. I'm sorry." "For what?" "For telling you not to go. For saying it was a fairy tale. For not believing." Maura thought about that. About the sister who'd had everything Maura lacked: stability, security, a husband who provided. Emma had never needed fairy tales because her life was already comfortable. She'd never understood that sometimes fairy tales were all you had left when reality offered nothing but exhaustion and bills. It's okay. You were being practical. And you were almost right. Almost? If I'd been practical, I'd have told the attorney to demolish the Windmill from New York. I'd never have come here, never found Willem's message, never opened the post chamber. Sometimes being practical means missing miracles. They stayed in the Netherlands for 2 more weeks, while paperwork was processed and preliminary authentication completed. The ministry arranged for them to stay in a nice hotel in Amsterdam, all expenses paid, treating Maura like the important person she still couldn't believe she was. They toured museums, where art like what they'd found was displayed. They visited the Anne Frank house, understanding more viscerally what Willem had risked, hiding Jewish families and their possessions. They walked along canals and ate stroopwafels and learned words in Dutch that Sophie pronounced better than Maura. Maura met with attorneys who explained the lengthy process ahead. Final authentication could take up to 18 months. The finder's fee would be paid in stages as each piece was confirmed and accessioned. She'd receive approximately €2 million within 3 months, the remainder over the following year. She also met with surviving Van Moa family members, 3 elderly cousins who lived in Israel, descendants of Hendrik's brother who'd escaped the camps. They wept when they saw photographs of the recovered art, pieces they'd heard about in family stories but never thought they'd see. Our grandfather talked about these paintings, one cousin said, touching a photograph of a Vermeer portrait. He said they were his brother's legacy, his soul captured in what he collected. The Nazis stole them, but your great-great-grandfather kept them safe. The cousins were entitled to several pieces under restitution law. They chose 3 paintings and several drawings, items with specific family history. The rest would go to Dutch museums, preserving Willem's wish that the art belonged to the Dutch people. "We want to do something for you," the eldest cousin said, "for honoring your ancestors' sacrifice and doing the right thing rather than trying to profit. The finder's fee is more than enough." "No, we mean something else. There's a foundation in Israel that funds education for children of Holocaust survivors and resistance members. We're establishing a scholarship in Willem Van der Berg's name. We'd like your daughter to be the first recipient." Sophie looked up at Maura, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means school is paid for, baby. All the way through college." On their last day in the Netherlands, they returned to De Hoop Windmill. The excavation had been filled in, the site secured. The building itself was scheduled for careful demolition in the spring, too deteriorated to save, but its wooden beams and stones would be preserved, some pieces going to museums, others to be reused in restoration of other historic windmills. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you," Maura said to the building, feeling foolish but needing to say it anyway. "But you did what you were supposed to do. You kept them safe." Sophie touched the wall gently, reverently. "Thank you for the treasure house." They took photographs, collecting memories of the place that had changed everything. As they walked away for the final time, Sophie asked, "What's going to happen to us now, Mama?" Maura thought about the life waiting for them in New York, thought about quitting jobs she'd hated, finding an apartment with enough rooms that Sophie could have her own bedroom, maybe going back to school herself to study something that mattered. "Whatever we want, baby. We get to choose now." 6 months later, Maura stood in their new apartment in a better part of Queens, nothing fancy, but clean and safe, with 2 bedrooms and windows that looked out on a small park. Sophie's room was decorated in blues and greens, with posters of windmills on the walls and books about Dutch history on her shelves. Maura had enrolled in a nursing degree program, using money that was hers to invest in herself rather than just survive. She'd also started volunteering at a local museum, working with their education department, learning about art and history and preservation. The first payment from the finder's fee had arrived €2 million, approximately $2.2 million after conversion and taxes. Maura had paid off every debt she owed, bought a reliable car, established college funds for Sophie, and put the rest in careful investments that would generate steady income. She wasn't wealthy by Emma's standards, but she was free in ways she'd never been before. The doorbell rang. Maura answered to find a delivery person holding a large flat package. Signature required. She signed, confused, and brought the package inside. The return address was from the Dutch Ministry of Culture. Inside was a photograph, museum-quality printing on archival paper. It showed one of the recovered paintings, not the Vermeer or Rembrandt, but a smaller piece that had particularly moved Maura when she'd seen it in the chamber. It was a landscape of Dutch countryside, with a windmill in the distance, painted in the 1800s by an artist whose name she couldn't pronounce. The painting itself had been valued at only €50,000, modest compared to the rest of the collection, but it had spoken to Maura because it looked like De Hoop, like the windmill that had saved them. A note accompanied the photograph. Dear Miss Hartley, this painting did not belong to the Van Moer collection. We found it in the chamber with the others, but provenance research reveals it was actually owned by Willem van der Berg's family. Purchased in 1900 by his grandfather, Willem must have hidden it with the other art for safekeeping. As such, it belongs to you as Willem's descendant. The Ministry of Culture would like to purchase it for our permanent collection to display alongside the Van Moer pieces as part of the complete story of Willem's heroism. We're offering €75,000. But if you'd prefer to keep it, that is entirely your right. With deep respect, Dr. Marieke van Doorn. Maura stared at the photograph for a long time, at the windmill captured in paint, at a piece of her family's history that had survived war and time and neglect to find its way to her. Sophie came to stand beside her. It's beautiful. Are we going to sell it? Maura thought about Willem van der Berg, who'd died protecting beauty from darkness. About Cornelius, who'd lived his whole life too afraid to be brave. About herself, who'd almost chosen practical defeat over impossible hope. No, she said finally. I think we'll keep it. Some things are worth more than money. She called the ministry that afternoon to decline their offer. The painting arrived 3 weeks later, professionally framed, accompanied by documentation of its history and significance. They hung it in their living room, above the couch where they sat together in the evenings. Maura told Sophie stories about Willem and Cornelius and the windmill that had kept secrets for 77 years. She talked about courage and faith and the importance of honoring the past while building the future. Emma visited from California a month later, meeting her niece and sister in their new circumstances. She walked through the apartment with an expression Maura had never seen before. Not exactly envy, but something closer to respect. I was wrong, Emma said, as they sat drinking coffee beneath the painting. About the windmill, about you chasing fairy tales. I was wrong about everything. You were being practical, Maura said. The same thing she'd told her before. But this time, it felt less like forgiveness and more like understanding. Practical is just another word for afraid, Emma replied. You were braver than me. The final payment from the finder's fee arrived 18 months after they'd found the chamber. The authentication was complete. All 12 paintings confirmed as genuine Van Moer collection pieces. The missing 12th had been in a crate they'd initially overlooked. The total value was assessed at €98 million, slightly higher than preliminary estimates. Maura's 10% came to €9.8 million over $10 million. She hired a financial advisor, established trusts for Sophie's future, donated generously to causes that mattered, resistance memorial foundations, art restoration programs, educational funds for children of refugees. She kept enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly, understanding that the true treasure wasn't the money, but the freedom it provided. On the 2-year anniversary of inheriting the Windmill, they returned to the Netherlands. De Hoop had been carefully demolished, its materials preserved and redistributed. Where it had stood, the municipality had created a small memorial park. A stone marker told Willem van der Berg's story, with a bronze plaque listing the names of families he'd saved. A second marker honored Cornelius, who kept faith with his father's legacy. And a third, added at Maura's request, simply read, "Some treasures wait in darkness, preserved by courage, revealed by hope." They stood in the park as Dutch wind blew across flat landscape, unchanged in centuries. Sophie, now 10 years old, placed flowers at the base of Willem's marker. "Mama, do you think he knew? When he hid the paintings, did he know we'd find them someday?" Maura thought about a man facing death, taking time to carve instructions into brick, trusting that someday someone would understand. "I think he knew someone would. I don't think it mattered who, but it mattered that it was us. Yeah, baby. It mattered that it was us." They visited Pieter, who'd become a friend and had helped Maura research their family history. He'd found documents and photographs that painted a picture of the Van der Berg family across generations, millers and merchants, ordinary people who'd done extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. "You're part of a long line of stubborn people," Pieter said with a smile. "Your grandmother fled rather than accept a life she didn't want. Willem risked everything to fight darkness. Cornelius held on for decades, waiting for the right person to trust. And you were brave enough to chase an impossible dream." "I was desperate enough," Maura corrected. "Sometimes that's the same thing." They had dinner at Saskia's cafe, where the owner had created a small exhibition of photographs documenting De Hoop's history and the art discovery. Tourists came now, drawn by the story, wanting to see where the miracle had happened. "You've made our village famous," Saskia said, serving them the same stroopwafels she'd given Maura on her first visit. CNN, BBC, even Japanese television came to film. "Everyone wants to know about the woman who found treasure in a windmill." "I didn't find treasure," Maura said, though she'd told this story 100 times. "I found what Willem van der Berg hid, what Cornelius van der Berg protected, what belonged to the Dutch people all along." "Ah, but that's why it's a good story. Because you did the right thing instead of the profitable thing." Flying home, Sophie fell asleep against Maura's shoulder, exhausted from the trip but happy in ways that made Maura's heart swell. They'd booked economy seats, despite being able to afford first class. And Maura was glad for it. She didn't need luxury. She just needed enough. And for the first time in her adult life, she had it. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, exhausted, desperate, working 3 jobs and still falling behind. That woman would have thought this life impossible, would have dismissed the windmill inheritance as another burden she couldn't afford. But desperation had given her courage to be reckless. Recklessness had led her to Willem's message, and Willem's message had led to freedom. No, not freedom treasure, the real kind, not the paintings or the finder's fee, but the knowledge that sometimes broken things led to beauty, that impossible gambles sometimes paid off, that choosing hope over practicality could change everything. Maura pulled out her phone and opened the photo gallery to a picture taken on their first day at De Hoop the Kras. Windmill broken and deteriorating, but still standing against grey sky. She'd been so afraid that day, so certain she'd made a terrible mistake. Now she knew. The only mistake would have been walking away. Sophie stirred, mumbling something in her sleep about windmills and paintings and Dutch words she'd learned. Maura kissed the top of her daughter's head and whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Cornelius. Thank you for trusting me." The plane banked over the Atlantic, heading west toward the life they'd built from courage and desperation and one old man's faith. Below them, the ocean held its own secrets, its own hidden treasures, waiting for people brave enough to look. But Maura had found her treasure. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 5 years after finding the hidden chamber, Maura stood in the auditorium of Columbia University, watching Sophie accept an award for her research paper on Dutch resistance art preservation during World War II. At 15, her daughter had become fascinated with the history that had changed their lives, diving deeper into Willem van der Berg's story than even Maura had imagined possible. My great-great-great-grandfather didn't just hide paintings, Sophie told the audience, her voice steady and confident. He preserved pieces of human soul that the Nazis wanted to erase. Every brushstroke he protected was an act of defiance, a declaration that beauty matters even in darkness. The audience applauded, and Maura felt tears she'd grown accustomed to over the years. These weren't tears of exhaustion or desperation anymore. They were tears of pride, of gratitude, of witnessing impossible things made real. After the ceremony, they walked through Manhattan together, past buildings that no longer intimidated Maura the way they once had. She'd learned that wealth didn't change who you were. Fundamentally, it just removed the barriers that had prevented you from becoming who you could be. "Mom, I've been thinking," Sophie said, using the more mature term she'd adopted recently, "about the Windmill site, about what should be there. The memorial park is beautiful. It is, but it's static. What if we created something living? A foundation that funds art students, helps preserve endangered cultural sites, supports families doing what Willem did, protecting beauty from destruction." Maura stopped walking, studying her daughter's face. Somewhere between 8 and 15, Sophie had transformed from a child who needed protection into a young woman who wanted to protect others. The change was breathtaking. "That's a beautiful idea. I know we can't save every windmill or fund every art student, but we could start small. Use some of the money for something Willem would have wanted, something that keeps going after we're gone." They spent the next 6 months planning. Maura worked with attorneys and non-profit specialists, while Sophie researched art preservation programs and interviewed restoration experts. The Van der Berg Foundation launched in the spring with an initial endowment of $2 million. Its mission was simple: preserve cultural heritage, support emerging artists, and fund education for children who showed promise but lacked resources. The first grants went to a windmill restoration project in Friesland, an art therapy program for refugee children, and scholarships for 20 students studying conservation. Emma flew in from California for the foundation's opening ceremony, bringing her own teenagers now, who listened to Sophie's story with wide eyes. Aunt Maura found a secret room under a windmill, and there was like $100 million in paintings. Sophie's cousin breathed, the story already becoming legend in their family. 98 million, Sophie corrected with a smile. And they weren't ours to keep. They belonged to a family the Nazis murdered. We just helped return them to where they belonged. But you got $10 million. We got the chance to do something meaningful, Sophie said, with a wisdom that made her seem older than 15. The money was just the tool. That night, after everyone had left and it was just Maura and Emma sitting in Maura's comfortable but not extravagant living room, her sister finally asked the question that had been hanging between them for years. "Do you ever regret it? Giving away so much of the money? You could have kept it all if you'd hidden the art, sold it privately." Maura looked at the painting above their couch, the Van der Berg landscape, with its windmill in the distance, the one piece she'd kept. Every single day, I think about what Willem chose. He could have sold those paintings, used the money to escape with his family. Instead, he hid them and died, protecting that choice. How could I dishonor that by being greedy? Most people would have. Maybe. But I learned something from that broken windmill, Emma. The treasure was never in the paintings. It was in becoming someone who could be trusted with them. The following summer, they returned to the Netherlands for the unveiling of a permanent exhibition at the Rijksmuseum, the Van Moer collection, preserved in darkness, revealed by light. All 12 paintings were displayed together for the first time in 80 years. Alongside Willem's story, photographs of the hidden chamber, and documentation of the recovery. The museum had also included Maura and Sophie in the exhibition, not as heroes, but as the final link in a chain of courage that spanned generations. Photographs showed the broken windmill, Cornelius's letter, the moment the chamber was opened. "This is our family's legacy," Sophie whispered, standing in front of a Vermeer that Willem had died protecting. "This is what it means to be a Van der Berg." At the exhibition's opening gala, Maura met others who'd recovered, looted art, who'd spent years tracking down pieces stolen by the Nazis. They shared stories of dead ends and breakthroughs, of families reunited with treasures they'd thought lost forever. One elderly woman, a Holocaust survivor who'd been a child when her family's Rembrandt was stolen, clasped Maura's hands with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thank you for doing it right. So many treasures are found and disappear into private collections. You gave them back to the world." That evening, standing on the museum's steps overlooking Amsterdam's canals, Maura reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 5 years ago, she'd been invisible, a single mother working 3 jobs, struggling to survive, dismissed by everyone, including herself. Now she stood among art historians and museum directors, descendants of resistance heroes and survivors of unimaginable darkness. Not because she was wealthy, but because she'd honored something larger than herself. Sophie joined her on the steps, linking arms the way they'd done since she was small. "What are you thinking about?" "About Cornelius. About how he was afraid his whole life to look for what his father had hidden. How that fear kept him from ever really living. But he wasn't a coward in the end," Sophie said thoughtfully. "Giving you the windmill when he could have taken it to his grave. That was brave." Maura nodded, understanding something new. Cornelius's final act hadn't been leaving her, a windmill. It had been trusting a stranger to be braver than he'd been, to do what he couldn't. That trust was its own form of courage. They walked back to their hotel through streets where bicycles outnumbered cars and history lived in every cobblestone. Tomorrow, they'd visit the memorial park, where De Hoop had stood, lay flowers at Willem's marker, and thank a ghost for changing their lives. But tonight, Maura simply felt at peace. She'd taken a desperate gamble on an inheritance she couldn't afford, traveled across an ocean on hope and borrowed courage, and found not just treasure, but purpose. The broken windmill had given her more than money. It had given her a story worth telling, a legacy worth preserving, and proof that sometimes the impossible was just waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to believe. As they walked, Sophie's phone buzzed with a message from a student at their foundation, thanking them for a scholarship that would let her study art restoration. Another life changed. Another person given the chance to preserve beauty. "We did good, Mom," Sophie said quietly. Maura squeezed her daughter's hand, thinking about all the broken things that had led them here. A fractured family, a deteriorating windmill, a desperate woman with no options left. All of it necessary, all of it part of the path to this moment. "Yeah, baby," she whispered back. "We did good," and somewhere in the Dutch night, the ghost of Cornelius Van der Berg smiled, his lifetime of cowardice finally redeemed by one desperate woman's courage. The windmill was gone, but what it had protected lived on in museums and students and families who would never know the name Van der Berg, but would benefit from its legacy anyway. Some treasures, Maura had learned, were meant to be shared, and in the sharing, they multiplied beyond measure. The end. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.